He clapped. Twice. Slow, sarcastic, sharp. "Now sit down, old man." But Arnold didn't. He adjusted the microphone, then lit the room on fire. What happened next didn't just shake the Capitol. It made America remember who still gets to stand. If this moment made you feel something, don't just scroll. Hit subscribe, because next time, the microphone might point at someone even louder. The room was live on 4 networks and half a dozen live streams. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly above the chamber, barely audible over the murmurs of aides flipping documents and reporters tapping notes. The Senate Committee on Federal Environmental Strategy had already passed the 3-hour mark. Tired eyes, short tempers, too much coffee, and too little air. But everyone was still there, because Arnold Schwarzenegger was still speaking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. Just leaned into the microphone with the posture of someone who had carried too many weights in his life to fumble over words now. He spoke of intergenerational duty, of environmental neglect, and of what it meant to build something worth handing down. His closing sentence was not a crescendo. It was a stillness. And so I believe that responsibility, like muscle, must be exercised, or it atrophies. The words hung in the air like the final breath of an anthem. Then it happened. J.D. Vance, seated across the room in a tailored navy suit and an expression too confident for someone that's still young, stood. Not all at once. Deliberate. Slow. 3 steps. 1. The air shifted. 2. He walked, not to his microphone, but toward Arnold's table. 3. He stopped just short of crossing the invisible boundary that exists in rooms where history sometimes lives. Then, he clapped. Twice. Slow. Sarcastic. Crisp. Like punctuation marks fired in reverse. And then the tilt, his head dipped sideways, not in deference, but in disdain. A theatrical pause before the line. "That was inspiring," he said, tone wrapped in barbed wire. "Now sit down, old man." The room didn't gasp. It recessed. A beat of silence so pure it could cut through steel. A coffee cup froze mid-sip. A staffer's pen hung mid-air, never reaching the page. A senior senator, white-haired, war-worn, and once a friend of McCain, raised his hand to his forehead, slow and small, like he'd just watched someone set fire to a flag, not a person. And then, almost beneath breath, he whispered, to no one in particular, "Not to him. Not like that." Just behind him, a young staffer dropped his pen. It didn't clatter, it landed like a verdict. His hand was shaking. He didn't even try to pick it up. Even the C-SPAN camera jolted as if it didn't know whether to pan or zoom or turn itself off. JD didn't sit back down. He stood with that kind of smugness that pretends to be casual, but grips the moment like it belongs to him. Arnold didn't move. For 5 seconds. 10. A full 11, the kind of silence that stretches out long enough for 1,000 clips to be made, captioned, and shared before it's even over. Then, slowly, he reached forward and adjusted the microphone. No reaction. No raised eyebrow. Just a breath that sounded like memory. He didn't look at JD. Not yet. He looked straight ahead, as if the insult hadn't even been addressed to him but to the very idea that time erodes relevance. Finally, his voice returned. Quiet. Controlled. But louder than anything else in the room. "What if the old man," he said, "still remembers how to stand?" JD blinked. A twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not a smirk, this time, just a pause. It was subtle, but everyone felt the axis shift. Not a rebuttal. A revelation. Not a comeback. A reckoning. No one moved. No gavel came down. No moderator interjected. Because for the first time in that long, stiff room, nobody knew whose time it was anymore. Outside the chamber, the hallway pulsed with incoming alerts. One reporter, eyes widening as he refreshed a thread, turned to a colleague. JD's team just sent out a video cut, 30 seconds, clipped mid-sentence. They're captioning it, "Out of touch and out of line." It's going up tonight. Inside, Arnold still hadn't sat down. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of the American psyche, a quieter question was taking root. When a command becomes a test of character, who crumbles, and who doesn't blink? The room was still bracing from the aftershock, the kind that doesn't fade with noise but deepens in silence. J.D. Vance remained standing, arms loose at his sides, like a man waiting for applause that didn't come. The cameras held on him, then turned slowly, inevitably, back to Arnold. The former governor didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or stiffen his jaw. He just breathed, slowly, with intention, and spoke into the microphone as if he was talking not to the man across from him, but to the country watching behind the screen. "When I was your age," he said, voice steady, "I was lifting tanks in Austria, dreaming of America." There was no anger in his tone. No hint of sarcasm. Only memory, raw, intact. "I didn't grow up with power. I didn't grow up with English. But I grew up with an idea of this country. And when I arrived, I carried more than weights. I carried gratitude." The shift was subtle, but it happened. A few heads turned, not toward J.D., but toward Arnold. On one side of the aisle, a congresswoman slowly set down her pen. On the other, a Republican aide crossed his arms, eyes narrowed, not in skepticism, but something closer to recognition. Arnold's hand rested flat on the table. His wedding ring clicked faintly against the wood as he adjusted his notes, then didn't look down. "You speak with entitlement," he said plainly, still not facing J.D. "I spoke with an accent, and still got heard." That line didn't echo through the chamber. It dropped, clean, precise, like a scalpel across something swollen and long ignored. J.D. shifted his weight slightly. Shrugged, the way someone shrugs when they've run out of cleverness but not yet realized it. The smirk was still there, but thinner now. More posture than presence. Arnold turned his head now, just slightly. "You mock age," he said, "because you think it won't punch back." Pause. But time punches last, and hardest. A faint exhale swept through the room, like the kind that follows a truth too sharp to dispute. A few chairs creaked as people subtly leaned forward. J.D. scoffed under his breath. It wasn't loud enough to be caught by every microphone, but loud enough to register. His body language said he'd heard it all before. His eyes said he didn't expect it to land. But it had. Not like thunder, but like depth. The kind of impact that doesn't break glass but *** rearranges the furniture in your memory ***. Outside the chamber, clips of Arnold's words were already hitting timelines. The first Twitter post, captioned simply "He remembers," had over 60,000 likes in under 15 minutes. Someone stitched the moment with a vintage clip of Reagan, blending timelines like parallel truths converging. Inside, Arnold hadn't moved. He didn't speak in flourishes. He spoke like someone who had been through too much to perform. Like someone who had no use for applause. "When I arrived in America," he said quietly, "I didn't have a seat at any table. I didn't have the right name or the right voice. But I showed up. I worked. I earned." He glanced around the room, not dramatically, but deliberately. "Some of us fought to enter the room," he said. "Others were born in it, and think they own it." This time, there was no mistaking the shift in air. The smirk on J.D.'s face broke, barely, but enough. His jaw tensed. His fingers tapped once against the side of his pants, a twitch he couldn't help. In the back row, a junior staffer mouthed the words, "Damn." The room didn't cheer. That kind of moment doesn't call for applause. It calls for recalibration. Because what had just been said wasn't loud, but it had *** weight ***. The kind of weight that doesn't trend for being flashy, but for being *** felt ***. And across living rooms and classrooms and waiting rooms nationwide, the same question began to take shape, not out loud, but somewhere deeper. Was the immigrant dream still part of the American memory? Or had we filed it away, under past tense, to make room for louder voices with shorter roots? And if someone who earned their seat could still be asked to sit down, what did that say about the room itself? The moment hadn't ended, it had metastasized. Inside the Senate chamber, the silence still held like the last breath before thunder. J.D. Vance had returned to his seat, his expression carefully blank, but the damage had been done. Arnold Schwarzenegger, without raising his voice or stepping out of line, had seized the room and refused to give it back. Across social media, the shift was immediate. A clipped video of Arnold's response, "What if the old man still remembers how to stand?" was already trending under multiple hashtags. People weren't just reposting it, they were quoting it in boardrooms, on campus message boards, even on bumper stickers. For a brief, flickering moment, the internet didn't crave louder, it craved older, steadier, earned. And that, to some, was a problem. Within minutes, a Maigre-aligned TikTok account released a heavily edited version of the moment. They'd kept the line, "What if the old man still remembers how to stand?" but slowed it, distorted it, and layered it over cartoon music and exaggerated reverb. Caption: "When Terminator thinks he's Cicero, the clip exploded, not just for laughs, but because it gave people permission to laugh. It turned restraint into punchline, clarity into delusion." Within an hour, the video had over 1.8 million views, half of them flooded with cry-laugh emojis and comments like "Boomer meltdown incoming," and "When your grandpa won't hand over the remote." Inside the Capitol press room, journalists took note. Some tried to analyze the cultural split. Others just updated their headlines to follow the algorithm's mood. But not everyone was laughing. Back inside the chamber, a younger senator leaned toward his colleague, eyes still fixed on Arnold. "He was always too green for the Red Party," he whispered. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was just the kind of political truth people say when they think the old rules no longer apply. Arnold didn't flinch. He had heard versions of that line before, from donors, strategists, even a few former allies. He had once been the pride of the party, a Republican governor of California, a centrist bridge in a burning age. But after 2008, the invitations had stopped coming. He wasn't asked to speak at the Republican National Convention. His name vanished from leaders to watch. His party hadn't kicked him out. They just stopped calling. The silence had been louder than any vote. And now, the same machine that once praised him for bipartisanship was letting J.D. Vance weaponize age as irrelevance. Letting social media turn a moment of dignity into viral ridicule. It wasn't just about one insult anymore. It was about how truth could be edited into parody, and millions would take the laugh over the meaning. In a podcast studio in Atlanta, a Gen Z host said, "Damn, that was clean," as he watched Arnold's full clip. Then his co-host pulled up the meme version and said, "Yeah, but this one's gonna stick harder." Stick harder. Not hit deeper. And that was the new economy. Attention without understanding. Back inside Arnold's office, the mood was mixed. Some aides were riding the high of the original clip. Others were already worried. One of them, Kira, sat at her desk sorting through the media mentions when a strange email slipped into the inbox. No subject line. No sender. The only message, "If he won't sit, maybe it's time someone made him." Attached, a single image file. A grainy photo of a courtroom sketch dated 2003. Kira froze. She didn't open the file. She didn't need to. She knew what it referenced. Everyone close to Arnold did. The headlines back then had faded, but the shadows hadn't. She looked toward the hallway where Arnold was still speaking to staff, voice calm, steady, as if none of this noise had reached him yet. But it would. She hit archive, but didn't delete the message. Outside the Capitol, the sun had begun to dip behind clouds. Protesters and supporters had started to gather, some with signs quoting Arnold's line, others with enlarged stills from the doctored clip. And somewhere in the mix, between real words and reverb jokes, the air carried an unease that hadn't been there before. Not just about who was right, but about how far someone might go to prove someone else doesn't belong. Because sometimes the loudest threat isn't said in front of cameras. It's sent in silence, with a file attached. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, as if trying to compete with the silence Arnold carried into the room. He had returned from the corridor slower than before. Not because of age, but because of something heavier than years. He carried it in the way his gaze didn't meet the cameras. In the way his thumb lingered too long over a crease in his notes. He didn't clear his throat. Didn't tap the microphone. He just looked up, exhaled, and began. "Back when Republicans didn't mock experience," he said, and his voice was calm, too calm, like a door creaking open in a house no one thought was haunted. They honored it. He paused. I said that years ago, on CNN, when they asked me what I thought had happened to my party. His hands rested on the table, fingers locked. The knuckles white, not from pressure, but memory. I told them, this is not the Republican Party I once joined. Reagan wouldn't recognize this. A few heads turned. Some recognized the line. Others remembered the clip, the one where Arnold didn't shout, but simply shook his head like a man mourning a friend still alive but already lost. I came to this country with nothing, he continued. Not even the words to describe what I wanted. And when I first ran for office, a donor told me, to my face, the American people want clear words, not subtitles. He paused again, not for drama, but because this time, it cost him to say it out loud. I laughed then. Pretended it was just part of the game. But when I got into my car, I didn't start the engine for 30 minutes. He looked down. Because it hurt. The room shifted. Not with noise, but with discomfort. The kind that lives in the back of the throat, where respect meets shame. I wasn't offended by the accent jokes, Arnold said, quieter now. I was offended by the idea that I didn't belong. That gratitude wasn't enough. That building something here still didn't make me of here. He set his papers aside. I've stood with this party. Took the arrows for trying to find the middle. Took silence instead of support when I called out corruption. And now, he nodded slightly, as if to no one in particular. Now the same machine that once welcomed me is hoping I disappear before I embarrass it. Somewhere in the chamber, a junior senator crossed their arms, no longer sure where loyalty lived. Arnold let the silence return, just for a beat, before he spoke again. You mock age, as if memory were a weakness. You forget that some of us earned our place in this room by carrying more than ambition. We carried names no one could pronounce, dreams too big for the visas we held, and stories we weren't allowed to tell out loud. He didn't blink. I've been told to sit before. Told to be grateful and quiet. But I've also seen what happens when too many people sit down at the same time. That was when it happened. From across the room, a quiet gesture broke the moment. A man stood, Senator Rhodes. Independent. Vietnam veteran. Once a bitter opponent of Arnold during the 2006 budget standoff. He said nothing. Just stepped forward, placed a single page in front of Arnold, then walked out of the room without waiting for acknowledgement. The top of the page read, Rules of Testimony Access, Draft Revision 2025. Arnold looked at it for half a second, just long enough to recognize it for what it was. A quiet, legislative nod. You still matter here. Outside the chamber, clouds were beginning to gather over DC in the literal sense. But inside Arnold's office, the storm had already arrived. Kira stared at her screen. A new email. No subject line. But this time, there was more. Attached, a scanned civil deposition from 2003. Redacted in parts. But not the name. His name. The subject line simply read, Still want to stand. She didn't open the PDF. She didn't need to. Arnold walked into the room a few minutes later. She didn't tell him, not yet. But the way he paused at the threshold, maybe he already knew. Because in America, standing has always come with a cost. And now, someone had decided he'd stood long enough. But the old man wasn't leaving. Not because he was invincible, but because pain was never the reason he sat down. And this time, it might be the reason he stayed standing longer. The leak didn't explode. It slid in sideways, like all good political weapons do. At 12:08 a.m., a Reddit thread surfaced, J.D. Vance's Lost Reagan paper. A faded scan, annotated by some over-caffeinated grad student, but its content was clean and lethal. In the second paragraph, the line was there, underlined, time-stamped, archived. We honor those who stood before us, because they made room for us to sit. By morning, it had detonated. CNN led with it. Substack writers spun essays within hours. A Politico alert read, Vance's past praise of elder statesmen resurfaces after Senate clash. And X, as always, made it a punchline. Looks like the old man didn't forget what the young man wrote. But it wasn't just the internet laughing now, it was remembering. JD, the rising star of the post-Trump right, had authored an ode to humility. And now, that same humility had turned to shrapnel. Inside Arnold's office, silence reigned. He sat watching a split screen, one showing JD's Reagan quote, the other replaying his own calm defiance. What if the old man still remembers how to stand? But he wasn't smiling. Across the room, Kira's phone buzzed. She checked the message, face going pale. She looked at Arnold. "We've got a problem." He turned. She held out the screen. A message from a journalist they both knew. Once a friend. Now just someone who owed the network ratings. "We're running it tonight, 8 p.m. Unedited. Make sure your guy has a comment ready." The attachment was the same file from the anonymous email. The 2003 deposition. Arnold's name. Redacted statements. No trial. No judgment. Just enough ambiguity to stain. He read the message, nodded once, then stood, and walked toward the chamber. But this time, it wasn't just to speak. It was to interrupt a verdict that hadn't even been delivered yet. The room wasn't ready for him. He entered like he wasn't waiting for permission. The gavel hadn't dropped. The floor wasn't his. But he stood. And when he began, his voice didn't rise. It dropped, weighted, steady, precise. "You once called Trump cultural heroin," Arnold said. "Now you serve it. That's not youth. That's addiction." JD didn't blink. But his lips curled, just slightly. Then, the pen in his right hand snapped in half. He didn't flinch. Just slid the broken pieces into his jacket. Arnold didn't stop. "I've made mistakes. Some I've admitted. Others I wish I had sooner. I'm not here because I claim moral perfection. I'm here because I believe in moral memory." One GOP senator, known for his fundraising machine and poker face, typed something into his phone so fast his aide glanced over involuntarily. "You want to bring up my past?" Arnold said. "Do it. I've lived it. But let's not pretend it's about justice. It's about fear. You fear what happens when people listen to someone who isn't afraid of their own shadow." Now the room was listening. Even JD turned his head, not to argue, but to hear how far this would go. Arnold leaned into the microphone. "You told me to sit down. But I'm still standing. Not because I've escaped consequence, but because I've faced it. You don't get to threaten someone with a past they've already walked through." He stepped back. No closing flourish. Just stillness. A full breath passed before anyone moved. Outside, cameras were already rolling. The 8 p.m. segment was locked in. But something had shifted, because now, they weren't just waiting for the past to crush him. They were watching to see if it still could. Far from the Capitol, in a diner outside Amarillo, Texas, a TV above the counter was tuned to the hearing. The sound was low, but Arnold's voice, clear and scarred, still carried. An older man, mid-70s, paused mid-bite. He set his fork down gently. Stood up. His granddaughter looked up from her fries. "Where you goin', Grandpa?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with a glance at the screen, he said, "Just wanna stand a minute. 'Cause not everyone standing is just getting old." And somewhere in the Capitol, in an office no longer silent, Kira looked again at the 8 p.m. warning. The storm was coming. But the old man was already standing in it. It aired at 8:01 p.m. sharp. No intro music. No soft lighting. Just a chyron that read, "Exclusive, the files Arnold doesn't want you to see." A blurred courtroom sketch. A deposition scan from 2003. Accusations once printed, long since forgotten, or buried, depending on who you asked. No verdict. No resolution. Just enough uncertainty to rot trust from the inside. The network ran it cold. No panel. No comment from Arnold's team. Because he hadn't given one. In a downtown DC bar, 3 TVs played the segment. On the far wall, one patron stared, eyes narrowed. He was old, In the way war makes you old. An army veteran. Black. 81. Once a cop who guarded the march in Selma, now just another invisible man in a room full of noise. As the clip looped, he whispered, to no one in particular, "They don't call me boy anymore. But they still want to call him old man, like that makes him easier to ignore." At that moment, his hand trembled slightly, and he reached for a glass of water, not to drink, but to keep his hand from closing into a fist. Because he'd seen this tactic before. Smear. Silence. Replace. But something strange happened. The backlash didn't bite the way the networks thought it would. Yes, the clip made waves. Yes, the partisan crowd jumped on it like red meat. But for every recycled accusation, something else was happening online. People remembered the man who had stood in front of the camera after January 6th, holding a sword from Conan the Barbarian, weeping, not as a performance, but as penance. Insert footage. My father was a broken man. I know where lies and intolerance lead. That video, buried in feeds, began to trend again. 40 million views then. More now. Because context doesn't expire. It deepens. And so, while the attack piece circled the airwaves, a new kind of clip began to rise. Arnold, that morning, staring into the committee room. I've made mistakes. But I've carried them. The question isn't who has a past. It's who's willing to keep showing up anyway. By midnight, dueling clips split the country again, one designed to disgrace, the other designed to remember. And somewhere in that rift, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered. No stamp. No digital trail. Arnold opened it with the care of someone used to threats. But this wasn't a threat. Inside, a photo. Yellowed. Creased. Two young men in fatigues, midlaugh, dust all over their boots. One of them was the veteran from the bar. On the back, a note, scrawled in shaky pen. You may not have served in our army, but you served the idea. That counts. RC, Cincinnati. Arnold held the photo for a long time. Didn't speak. Didn't move. And then, quietly, he turned it face down on the desk, placed both hands flat, and closed his eyes. Elsewhere, the headlines kept spinning. Schwarzenegger's past reignites Senate tensions. J.D. Vance survives political blowback as GOP circles wagons, but none of them knew what Kira knew. That just hours before, Arnold had received another message. Short. Direct. From a former aide in the White House press corps. They're not trying to discredit you. They're trying to make you tired. They want you to sit, not because you're wrong, but because you're inconvenient. That night, Arnold didn't post. Didn't tweet. Didn't defend. He simply walked, alone, through the Lincoln Memorial, lit not by camera flash, but by something far older. Legacy. He looked up at the words carved into stone. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. He said nothing. But something inside him settled. And when he turned to leave, an older woman, tourist, maybe, or pilgrim, caught his eye and whispered, "We're still listening. Even if the microphones aren't." And Arnold nodded. Because standing wasn't always about the speech. Sometimes, it was about outlasting the noise. The Capitol session resumed with less noise than usual. Not because it was over, but because something had passed. A kind of invisible threshold. In the days since Arnold had been told to sit down, the story had outgrown the chamber. It had breached walls and talking points. It had turned into something people whispered about on subway platforms and argued over in classrooms. Not about policy, but about posture. And now, he sat quietly at the edge of the hearing room, alone, but far from silent. Cameras followed J.D. Vance as he entered late, his posture sharp but clipped. The scandal around his past writings hadn't derailed him, but it had rearranged the room's oxygen. He avoided eye contact. He didn't need to apologize. His party wasn't asking for that. Still, something had shifted. Arnold didn't rise this time. He waited. Until the chair recognized him. He adjusted the microphone. No preamble. Just clarity. I don't mind being called old. A few heads lifted. He waited. Let it breathe. I don't mind being mocked. I've been mocked in 2 languages and 4 accents. I've been underestimated since the day I stepped off the plane with a dream and muscles and not much else. A few smiled, those old enough to remember the VHS tapes and grainy magazine covers. But age is not the insult you think it is, Arnold said. It's just the receipt for every fight I didn't walk away from. A low rustle echoed across the room, paper shifting, pens freezing mid-stroke. Age means I've seen this country break promises and still find a way to make new ones. It means I've failed people and had to earn them back. It means I know what it feels like to lose a room and keep talking anyway. JD shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough to show he was listening now. Arnold leaned forward. I don't speak for everyone. But I speak for those who remember when standing wasn't a performance, it was a decision. When dignity didn't need a trending hashtag. From a seat near the back, a young woman, staffer, maybe, first internship, lowered her phone and just watched. No screen. No feed. Just presence. Arnold's tone dropped further. I didn't come here to win. I came here to remind. He looked across the aisle, not at JD, but beyond him. Remind you that democracy doesn't erase people when they age. It doesn't mute them when they speak slower. It doesn't trade them in for newer models. And then came the final line. The future isn't something we inherit automatically. It's something we earn, or lose. Silence. But not emptiness. It was the silence people sit in when they're not sure what side of themselves they've just been shown. Somewhere outside the Capitol, a news anchor on MSNBC shook his head, turned to camera, and said, J.D. Vance won the laugh. But Arnold won the memory. And memory, unlike likes, doesn't expire. The clip was replayed again and again, stitched to moments people hadn't remembered they'd saved. Of Reagan with immigrants, of John McCain defending Obama's decency, of Barbara Jordan asking Congress to honor truth. A kind of echo started. In a steel plant in Michigan, a man paused his welding torch and turned up the volume. In a church basement in Atlanta, an elder paused her meeting and played the speech again for a younger crowd. And in that same diner in Amarillo, the old veteran stood once more, not out of pain, but out of principle. His granddaughter asked again, "Why are you standing now?" He replied, "Because that old man reminded me what that means." No hashtags. No campaigns. Just a moment that refused to fade. A man once famous for never backing down had just taught America something harder. How to stand when it's easier to sit. And how to keep standing. Even when the room wants you gone.